新年快乐. Happy Year of the Wood Snake, everybody. All right. Oh, you know what? I need a clicker. All right. Well, today we're going to talk about narwhals. Actually, not just narwhals. So this story, like all good stories, begins in the ancient past, 2009. When I'm breezing along the dark blue waters of the Pacific Northwest in my handmade traditional kayak. And it's a beautiful sunny day here in the San Juan Islands of Washington. And I brought a couple of friends out with me to see the rock stars of these waters, killer whales. And so we're paddling out there. We see the sparkles. We see the orcas. It's a big pot of them. And it is my friend Erin's dream, lifelong dream, to see orcas in the wild. So she's spellbound. And there were three of us start paddling like cartoon characters through the water. And we stop about 100 yards away like you're supposed to. But the orcas, they haven't moved much. They're just hanging out. So Erin leans in close, gives me a mischievous smile and says, "Hey, let's sing to them." Now, I have to admit, at this time, in my 20s, my self-image was more of a tough wilderness guide, and not that of a man who sings to whales. But I actually love singing. And I felt really sheepish, and I didn't join in. But eventually, at some point, right around when they started breaking into the Beatles, I remembered. I remembered something from a story my grandmother used to tell me when I was a child. And in that story, one of the lines was, if you want the whales to visit you, you have to sing to them. So my grandmother was Denai Huchachu, or Siberian native, from Manchuria. And for Nais, orcas are our relatives. So once, a long time ago, the orcas were people, only they had special clothing, kind of like an orca onesie. You could zip it up and then poof, you transform into a killer whale. Now, when Erin and Michael started the opening words of, "Hey Jude," I couldn't resist anymore, so I sang and I laughed. I could just feel that song going down my legs, vibrating the skin of my kayak and going into the water. And moments later, the fins of the orcas turned and they made a direct beeline for us. Time slowed down, and I can remember Erin just shrieking with delight about something. And I turned just in time to see an orca cat pop its little nose up out of the water right next to me, and then shove the stern of Erin's kayak. And then I could feel it, because a wave of pressure went under me as something dark darted underneath my kayak, and I could feel it up through my legs, up through the hull of the kayak, and I was enthralled, so I kept on singing, and I have been singing ever since. So anytime I'm around orcas, I let my voice out into the wind, and my orca relatives will come and visit me in my kayak. Every single time I've done it, they have come to visit. And in fact, this summer, I actually finally remembered to record this amazing event, and it happened with beluga whales when I was in the Canadian Arctic. I go there with you. It's all I can do. What's happening? They're such happy whales. That day, that was how I learned that my grandmother knew things, unexplainable things. That it was the beginning of my deeper understanding that the stories that my grandmother told me when I was growing up were far more than just tales. They carry with them a deep knowledge of living, for millennia of living with the land and the sea. And I think maybe that was the moment that my life took a serious new turn. In my 40s, I became a National Geographic photographer, and I started pitching stories that took me to Indigenous communities around the world and began to see that there is actually a powerful link between the world's most beautiful places and the people that live in them. In fact, Indigenous territories comprise about 40% of all remaining land on Earth and contain more biodiversity than national parks. I want to start in the island nation in the Pacific, in Palau, which is close to the Philippines. And the coral reefs of Palau, they have among the highest biodiversity amongst the world's seas. They are also some of the most resilient to climate change. So the Scripps Oceanographic Institute, which you guys will have heard of over here, tracked changes to the coral and actually found that Palauan reefs actually recover from coral bleaching amazingly fast. Why? Because of the great numbers of healthy fish. And that includes fish like these young reef sharks who are living in the protection of a mangrove lagoon. The indigenous Palauans made history when they were the very first ones to declare their waters a shark sanctuary. Palau is full of magical animal encounters like this beautiful black-banded sea snake, one of the most venomous and beautiful. This image actually made the cover of the 2023 National Geographic Pictures of the Year. But I don't want to just stay under the ocean. We're going to move to the world's oldest rainforest, Australia's wet tropics. So what's weird is that the wet tropics, which has been government protected for decades, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And yet, there, the biodiversity is actually falling. The wet tropics used to be a quilt of different ecosystems, from rainforest to meadows to mangroves. But without human intervention, mature rainforest actually takes over and decreases the biodiversity. And that includes the decline of amazing species like these Muppet velociraptors, the cassowaries. So they are a keystone species, basically essential workers, right? Because they eat and they poop out the seeds of rainforest plants. And without them, 150 species of rainforest plants wouldn't be able to propagate. Like the cassowary, human beings are also essential to the health of the forest. So the wet tropics are the homeland of the Jabugai people, who have been here for tens of thousands of years, possibly as long as 60,000 years. And during that time, they have shaped the landscape around them using a special tool, fire, specifically cultural fire. Cultural burning expert Damian Hunter here, he works here, and his fires are not the raging fires that you've been seeing in the news that ate LA. No, those are the kinds of the fires that burn during hot, windy weather, right? But Damian waits until the forest and the soil underneath the forest is moist and cool. Cool, slow fires like his are actually forest managers, and they consume the leaf litter like little Roombas of the forest. When Europeans first came to Australia in the late 1700s, they saw fire as a destructive force, a terrible force, and they banned indigenous fire practices, jailing people for burning the forest in ways that they didn't understand. But the unfired lands grew thick with all of this flammable brush, and species like the critically endangered Kuranda tree frog started to vanish. And then all the raging wildfires started across Australia. Remember back in 2019 when we saw all those pictures of toasted koalas? By eliminating the burns of indigenous peoples, Australia had made hot burns inevitable. But indigenous fire is returning across the continent. When I started this project, I didn't understand how indigenous peoples had been able to steward the lands so effectively, why they were the world's best conservationists. But I knew the statistics. So I needed to go out into the real world and ask the question, why are indigenous communities so often so good at conservation? And the answer is this crazy long phrase, traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. So TEK is the knowledge that indigenous peoples acquire by living for centuries in their homelands, crystallized into stories and songs. TEK is about an entire community working together to monitor their environment that they live in, right? And one of those forms of TEK is here in Palau. Palau's ancient system of fishery management called BUL, or B-U-L. And this is how it works even today. So one day, a chief hears from a fisherman that there's not a lot of parrotfish left at a certain reef. So the chief, who is a fisherman himself, goes out there, goes free diving, looks around, and oh yeah, there's not a lot of parrotfish here. So the chief declares a closure of that reef. That reef gets closed down, and then another area, he opens up another one. And that is how the fishery is kept so healthy. On the other side of the world, there's a system of management that is very different than the Western system that is harder to understand. But in Greenland, the traditional ecological knowledge is actually written down as considered the world's oldest written conservation law. To maintain narwhal populations, for example, TEK says that Inuit, who are the people of North Greenland, must hunt traditionally in calving areas by paddling out in kayaks by hand and harpooning narwhals by hand instead of using rifles and motorboats. And like the kayak, the dog sled is critical to life in North Greenland. Inuit have depended on Greenland's sled dog for centuries. Sled dogs don't need to be barged in from far away. They don't need fossil fuel to run. And in North Greenland, it's the only breed of dog. In fact, they are what we call semi-domesticated, and they're still so similar to wolves that they can't even bark. They only growl or they howl, or I think of it as singing. They sing in chorus, the background song of Greenland. I love dog sledding on the ice, accompanied by the rhythmic whooshing of the padding of the dogs running. This is life at its most vibrant, lived in the now. I'm immersed in all the pale sights and the quiet sounds, breathing in that crisp, cold air, punctuated by the occasional whiff of dog farts. Indigenous peoples often fight for goals that take decades to accomplish. And one such place, you guys will be familiar with this, is Northern California. Enormous dams were built on the Klamath River in the early 1900s, and those dams blocked salmon and spread disease. Because the dams slowed the rivers, they created this perfect habitat for a salmon-killing parasite. And that parasite just decimated the salmon population. So just 10 years ago, Ron Reed and his sons would calm down and catch 20 salmon in a single day. And they'd make the rounds through the community, through the Karuk and Yurok Native community, handing out fish. And they had a lot of happy relatives, right? But by 2020, he wasn't able to catch a single one. 30 years ago, the Klamath peoples started suing the power companies and staging protests to bring down the dams. They sent tribal members to Warren Buffett's annual shareholder meeting. And the billionaire was shamed into the biggest dam removal history project in history. And by summer last year, all the dams are down. Yeah, exactly. It's an amazing success. And this is the Klamath River now, here. This was in August 2024. It looks even nicer than this now. Once that last dam went down, the river returned to its original banks underneath all that water. Within months, the valley looked like it had 150 years ago. Another place where they look generations into the future is the Amazon. So the Amazon rainforest is, of course, almost entirely indigenous land. And one section in Ecuador is particularly impressive. This is the homeland of the Kofan people. And Kofan lands are particularly special because they have the highest biodiversity of any single place, any region on Earth. I spent a month here with Kofan leader Hugo Lucetante. And Hugo was sent away from his village when he was just 10 years old. He'd never left the rainforest before, but the elders who shipped him to Seattle had given him a mission to save his homeland. He would leave his home to gain a Western education, learn multiple languages, no big deal, and return to fight for his people. And what Hugo learned to fight was this industry. Beginning in the 1970s, oil companies began drilling, and the result was massive deforestation and pollution. But the Kofan fought drilling for the next 50 years, aided by leaders like Hugo, and they were so successful that they became role models for the rest of Latin America. So today, we are at a critical moment. I think everyone knows this. The cutting edge realizes now that the formula to protect a place is not to kick out the people living in it, to not evict its indigenous stewards, but instead they understand that the most beautiful intact lands are beautiful because of their people. But I want you to hear from their voices directly. In Greenland, Mads Ole Christiansen says, hunters are seeking balance. That is why we take care of our place. We are the balance. That is why we're hunters. In Australia, Ranger Topsy Gibson says, culture of fire is a very big thing. Yeah, fire brings more wallabies down to the beach and other little creatures. It brings back that soft grass for them to eat. Ugo Lusitante says, if the world truly wants to protect its forests, then efforts like ours need to be recognized for what they are. The hard labor of people who must also feed their families and raise their children. And then finally, there's Lisa Hillman, kissing her husband Leaf on the banks of the newly restored Klamath River. And as she was there celebrating the return of the river, it even smelled like a wild river again. And she said, this land belongs to you. You belong to this land, so you must care for it. Thank you very much.